All right, this is the Coast to Coast Combat Hour for March 24th. I forget how many days deep into quarantine we're in. Matthew, how is it going on the West Coast?
Surviving, not shaving, eating a lot, eating a lot healthier though. I'll tell you that, man. I cooking your every meal for the last about 10 days or so. So uh, it's not a terrible change, but yeah, it definitely gets a little quiet in the quarantine. I did go to work for a couple hours this morning though, so it was nice to at least get out and uh, at least see people, not necessarily interact with them, but see that the world is still somewhat ticking.
Yeah, I mean, everyone keeps using the term lockdown and stuff like that. It's more like, I mean, I don't know about you, but by me, it's more like a curfew. And if you're dicking around with in groups and stuff like that, then they'll probably like make you stand 6 feet apart. But outside of that, I mean, it's been pretty quiet here on the East Coast. I'm in Jersey, just below New York, which is like the highest infected place in the country. So, and folks that listen to the podcast know New York is where I like to go to get my good beer and good women and all that stuff. And so I'm being made to stay away from all that. So pretty boring here in Jersey.
Yeah, you're stuck there in Jersey. Yeah, no, we're both bachelors, so we're used to a little bit of quarantine, more
Yeah.
more than at least the average family man is.
Yeah,
But
I know. I was saying that to you when we were planning to go on just now. I was just saying that the only thing that sucks for me, it's like it's not too different from my day-to-day life. I just can't obviously I can't go to training with all this social distancing, but that's the only thing that's bothering me right now.
well, you're getting a chance to get caught up on a bunch of your writing with all of your different outlets. So at least you got that going. Although the content right now is fairly thin for news related stuff.
Oh,
Pretty
that's Fernando from last week. He was MMAnews.com managing editor. Yeah,
yeah.
we're good to go, Fernando. Don't worry. We're this your request is sort of inspired what we're going to talk about in this week's podcast.
Yeah, and I hope you're doing safe yourself, Fernando. So appreciate the well wishes. But yeah, everything we're both seem to be doing fine, and just trying to avoid the craziness that potentially I guess could still come down the pike. So
Yeah.
I mean, just recent news, just to jump into a couple things before we really kind of get into our topic for the show. We've seen Dana White essentially say that UFC 249 will go down, not in Brooklyn, the East Coast cursed arena.
Thank God. I mean, that's kind of
They're
a
at
good thing.
Barclays, so maybe it's a good thing that you just don't get the event at all. We'll just
Yeah.
we'll just skip all the minutia and get straight to the point. So that'll be interesting to see where that happens. I know Japan had a K1 event this weekend, one of their big yearly K1 Fiesta shows. I didn't catch it. It's not. They still don't make it really easy for a simple man to be able to
Yeah.
find online. But I know
Well,
they
I
had
mean,
an arena full of people. So
oh really?
yeah. So
Yeah.
uh, Japan doesn't have a lot of issues as far as numbers with the coronavirus right now, but definitely a bit of a bold and some people saying stupid move, having an arena full of people. So how that
Yeah.
unfolds.
Uh, then the other thing was it was actually I know Fernando did the results over at MMA News, and I did the live results for my MMAnews.com. The Cage Warriors event that was on Fight Pass that was closed off, much like UFC Brasilia. They got a new lightweight champion over there, and Mason Jones. He actually said he'd like to defend one time before he gets any calls from the UFC, which he probably will get that chance, or maybe not, depending on how things. I think UFC. The UK just further locked down after that event, so that might be a while for him. But I mean, it's not completely stagnant in combat sports. I know ESPN's been showing a lot of old stuff and the dramatized versions of events and stuff like that. So you and I kind of started talking about, well, why don't we instead of going off of the catalogs that and the stuff that's being re-aired, why don't we just talk about some of our own especially you more so than me because you've been to more live events than I have. But um, what we were going to go back down memory lane and talk about the fights that the fights that kind of like or the events that kind of really hooked us into the sport that we found had us make this podcast. So I know you have a longer list than I do, so you might as well take it from here.
Well, yeah, I mean, 99.9% of us that got into the into MMA and the love of combat sports, if it didn't come from boxing, came from the UFC. So obviously, those events, the initial tournaments 1 through 7, and then 8, and then we had the 9, which fights, and then 10 brought back the tournament, and then we started getting into the 4-man tournaments and such. So a lot of that old school no holds barred stuff is stuff that's a given. I wanted to focus on a couple events that that maybe the just bleed in me, but the events that I watched the hell out of when I was right in the midst of the UFC, because people complaining about events right now. Well, you got to remember there used to be 3, 4, 5 months between UFC events, and that's all you had up until about 1996. So for the first couple years of it was UFC was what you had access to, and then you started seeing some VHS traders and Panther Productions in the old Black Belt magazine would sell VHS, and you would have to overpay. You'd end up spending like $60 on a video VHS tape from an event in Brazil. Well, I went out and did it, and I actually sitting on. I still have much of my VHS. But the one that really got me going was the World Vale Tudo Championship. The first event took place in Brazil, took place in Japan. Was headlined by a super fight between Marco Ruas, who at the time, being a UFC guy, you knew him, and then Steve Jenham, who is famous for being the alternate who won UFC 3. So they set up a super fight at that time, and it was the UFC 7 champ against the UFC 3 champion. Jenham was still a bit of an unknown at the time. He got some flack. He came into UFC 4, picked up a nice win over Milton Bowen. And then he had and then he eventually lost to Tank Abbott in the Ultimate. But he was still a little bit of an unknown. And back then, everybody was kind of an unknown. And his style was ninjutsu. So back then, you still weren't sure if somebody was a ninja or you didn't know. It was just a totally different time in the sport, as I'm sure you can confirm that as well, Ed. But the event was big. And
when was that again?
This is in 1996, August 14th, 1996. It took place in Tokyo, Japan. So it was headlined by like I said, a super fight between Jenham and Ruas, and then it also had an 8-man no holds barred bare knuckle tournament. And while the names in the tournament were at the time, there weren't any big names per se. The only name in it that eventually got me a little bit hooked was a guy named Richard Red Herd, who came up through this. He actually goes on to win the tournament. I mean, I hate to do spoilers, but that's kind of where we're at. I actually ended up training with the guy after this. So it was something I kind of got into it after watching this. I saw him, and then the next, a few months later, all of a sudden I'm at the gym, and in comes Red Herd. So turned out to be a really tough dude. Didn't have a whole lot of success beyond World Vale Tudo Championship. He fought in the first couple and made a name for himself. But the tournament's outstanding. Open weight, just chaos. They follow that event up with World Vale Tudo Championship 2. And this is kind of where they all of a sudden back then, again, like you had a handful of events. So you had a bunch going on in Brazil, but nothing that people really knew of. Circo de Lutas and just all these Vale Tudo events. But these were the ones that were coming out on video. That's I got this one. This is the number 2 event, World Vale Tudo Championship 2. This was actually a super fight set up between Marco Ruas and Oleg Tektarov, a rematch from their bout at the Ultimate 1 in the UFC. which Oleg Tektarov ended up winning a judge's decision. They rematched in Brazil. That was set up as the super fight. This one's a 30-minute no time or 30-minute time limit. They extended a little bit. Fight's not super exciting. Both of the guys' styles didn't lend itself to each other. Huas boxes him up, but just seeing those two guys, especially during this time frame, and then the tournament on this one though is really where it stepped up. You had names like Vernon Tiger White.
That's old school.
Old school. Richard Hurd, again, the winner of the first tournament, slides in again to this tournament. And then you have Pedro Rizzo, who makes his MMA. I can't recall if it was his MMA debut or if it was just his. He might have fought in Brazil, but this was his first coming out fight and anything. So he was obviously Huas's protege. So Pedro Rizzo comes in. I won't give the total spoilers for that. Great tournament, wild craziness. Again, would definitely recommend Valley 2, 1, 2, and 1 and 2.
I remember Pedro Rizzo was one of the first guys that I saw use like leg kicks effectively. Or am I thinking of Marco Huas?
Huas used kicks against Paul Varlan's at UFC 7 in the final. That's where he was the first one to really chop somebody down with leg kicks over a long period of time. But Huas didn't fight as often, and he was older. So basically, Pedro Rizzo was not a mini me, but a clone, a younger clone of, I think, where we think Pedro Rizzo, or I'm sorry, where Marco Huas eventually would have, what he would have been if we would have rewound the clock 10, 12, 13 years. And then Rizzo went on to use those leg kicks extremely successfully in the UFC, getting 2 title shots against Randy Couture at heavyweight, and arguably winning one of those despite the judges' decision in their first bout. The World Valley Tudo Championship ended up putting on 14 events, but the third one is the one that 1 and 2 build up, and then it's like third all of a sudden you had this. I feel like that's the one that, I mean, it's just violence. I mean, you have 2 fights where fights end with people fleeing the ring. And it's the debut of Mark Kerr. So you get a totally smashing machine, raw, still scared Mark Kerr. I think if you watch Smashing Machine, the documentary, he really humanizes it by being afraid, essentially, of what he's getting into. And the rawness and there's some gore in this. You've got, his fight with Paul Varlan's, his fight. He eventually ends up fighting Fabio Gurgel, who he outweighs by like 70 pounds, and he fights him for 30 minutes. And it is just these are when the fights were just pure blood and guts and heart.
It's funny you mentioning Mark Kerr, because I had to write a piece on him for my MMA news, because before all this happened, with UFC 244, The Rock talked about how he's supposed to be doing a Smashing Machine movie, which I would imagine is on hold with everything else now. But when he mentioned Mark Kerr's name, he didn't get the pop that he was probably hoping for. When he talked about Mark Kerr, he referred to him as the founding father of this, one of the founding fathers of MMA, which is kind of true, because a lot of folks that, like, if there's folks that didn't get into the sport from watching The Ultimate Fighter, like a lot of folks have, and we've had like Mike Pendleton and guys like that, and Nolan King all say that they got into it from watching Ultimate Fighter. If they didn't get into it from watching those things, the Smashing Machine, especially when it aired on HBO, got them interested, or put MMA on their radar. So I had to rewatch that to write my piece on him, because I own it. It's actually in my living room now. Folks that haven't noticed, I changed where I sit, but my living room / kitchen over here in Carbazal Manor. But whatchamacallit? So the brutality that they show in a lot of his fights from back then, I feel like if that was how fights, especially if those the old school Pride rules and the whole thing that happened back then, if that was even in question now, the sport wouldn't be where it's at today. It would definitely wouldn't be where it's at today. Because I'm talking about BMF titles, those were some BMFs back then. Mark Kerr's definitely one of them. But I mean, I know you had just mentioned yours. Uh, my stuff is a little bit more. I don't want to say big league, I guess, comparatively, as far as maybe it was a little bit longer lasting promotions. So in relation to everyone else, like obviously the first UFC got me interested, and I would watch them, and I did just like you. I used to go to Palmer Video and get the old VHS tapes, like Ultimate. When Tank Abbott knocked shut that dude off against the fence. I already forgot his name.
Steve Nelmark.
Yeah. When Steve Nelmark falls down and it looks like he just left his soul leaves his body, and I would watch those or whatever, but I didn't care about technique or anything like that. So for me, it was actually a little bit later, definitely in the 2000s. I've talked about it. I've definitely tweeted it a bunch of times when folks bring it up. Wasn't even the main event of the event. UFC 53, back when they called events names, heavy hitters here.
I was going to say, is that the heavy hitters one?
Yeah.
So is that Arlovsky and Buentello or Arlovsky and Eilers?
Justin Eilers versus Andrei Arlovsky, but that's not the fight that got me. It's the co-main event between Karo Parisyan and Matt Serra.
Great fight.
Exactly, and it was that was in 2005. And the reason why that one in particular sticks with me, I've actually rewatched that a few times, is because that was in June of 2005. I started jiu-jitsu July 2005, because watching those guys go back and forth and watching the throws and the sub attempts and the escapes, I was just like, oh my god, this is to me, it was otherworldly. And it's one of the most exciting. First of all, Matt Serra should have won that, in my opinion, because once it starts off, Matt Serra had dropped Karo Parisyan, and I who was the referee? I wonder if I can. I don't see who the referee was in it, but it might have been my boy Yamasaki.
I was gonna say, pretty much back then, it was the rotation of Yamasaki, Mazzagatti, or I don't even. John McCarthy might have even been a little bit on the outs right there, but yeah it wasn't.
But Matt Serra, I thought, should have won that fight. If they stopped fights the way they stopped him now, Matt Serra would have won that fight. But that didn't happen. The fight went all 3 rounds, and it went to a decision for Karo Parisyan. And it was hard to argue after the hit, the way that they fought afterwards. It was just hard to argue. But the throws, submission attempts, reversals, and escapes. I mean, that's just it's probably the best back and forth you'll see with 2 grapplers fighting in MMA, and I'm talking high paced. I mean, if you were going to look, if you wanted to watch a high paced, all out mixed martial arts fight, UFC 53 co-main event between those 2, man. I mean, that's the fight that grabbed me, and then I just wanted to see more and more after that. So for me, I mean, and you mentioned Smashing Machine and Mark Kerr, so I went like going buying the DVDs for all the past Pride events until I eventually Boss Rutan came here to Elizabeth, New Jersey. Dan Miragliotta used to have a gym in Elizabeth, and he had him do a seminar there, and that's where I first met Boss. And he just kind of like, he actually said, if you want to learn about the way this sport is evolving, watch Pride events and the commentary, and you can learn a thing or two. So that's what I made it a point. That's what I made it a point to go and see. Fernando's talking about Mazzagatti.
Before you jump into Pride, I want to make a couple quick comments about UFC 53, and I just pulled up the fight card, and there was also 2 fights on that card. That one that's worth watching again is David Loaiza versus Charles McCarthy. I don't know if you remember, but it ends in one of the early, like, brutal body kicks. I don't try to get technical with all names. I think it was just a spinning back, reverse spinning back kick, basically, right to the
Yeah.
body. Okay. And then the opening bout of that night, I don't know if you remember, it was Nick Diaz
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
Koji Oishi.
Yeah.
That might be that. I would say that's easily one of the top 10 weirdest fights in MMA history. Um, I don't know if you remember, but you remember Oishi fighting a Diaz who, pitter pattered punched the hell out of people, decided not to cover his face to keep his hands down.
Yeah.
And while the fight only lasted a minute and a half,
Yeah.
you almost got to see it to believe it, because it's easily one, like I said, one of the weirdest, certainly one of the worst strategies in MMA history. But I just want to throw those out there. Those are, looking at the fight card, those are two fights that jump out at me as ones that I remember
Yeah. Well,
vividly.
the other thing about that fight card, I mean, outside of it being in Atlantic City, New Jersey, there was only 8 fights on the card. Now if you have a less than a dozen or 13, it's considered a shorter card. And the pay, the attendance was only 12,000. The gate was a
The gates will
million.
make you sick. If you look at
Yeah,
the gates compared to the payout, I was looking at that the other day, and there was some that were like, this is right before the
$1,100,000, and they only sold 9,000 pay-per-views, which by today's standards means you got to shut down your fight business.
your shark fight
Yeah.
if you're selling 9,000. But so you go ahead and get back into the pride things. I just wanted to jump out for if anybody's going to look these fights up individually. Like you said, for MMA, the Parisyan Serra fight is the fight of the night on that card.
That's the one that got me. Yeah, I mean,
But just for entertainment, the Loaiza again, and it's Loaiza building himself up to an eventual title shot. At the time, he was a killer and an up and coming potential star. And then Diaz, who everybody knows and loves, in one of his early fights, again in a fight, minute and a half long, doesn't take long, but if you find it, him versus Oishi, just bizarre as hell, and you'll get a little chuckle out of about watching that fight, I would think.
yeah. Yeah, and then obviously, like I said, I mean, you'd be hard to find. I mean, you could go through all of Pride's catalog and find a lot of fights that you'd like, but
It does say, by the way, Yamasaki was the referee for Parisyan.
Of course he
Serra.
was. Of course he was.
So you did nail that one.
Yeah, that might be where my problem with him started. But anyway, let me shut up because he still refs a lot of PFL events, and I cover a lot of PFL events.
Well, you get the hard or whatever the hell he does, right?
Fucking weirdo. Doesn't like Justin Bieber or somebody do that too? I don't even know.
Hey, at least he's apparently sober during the fights, unlike Herb Dean. Well, never mind. But go ahead with your.
So the Pride Final Conflict Absolute, that was in September of 2006. It was the closing rounds, the semifinals and the finals of the open weight Grand Prix, which was like, to me, that was if you want to try to call folks BMF, that's the real way to figure that out, because obviously no weight classes. You had little dudes fighting big dudes, and back then a young Mirko Krokop fought at was he a 205 or a 185er back then?
Krokop? No, he was heavyweight. Krokop's never. I mean, he maybe in K1 he did, but he's always been a heavyweight. Yeah.
Yeah, I might be confusing him with Wanderlei too, because I know Wanderlei was 180. Oh, you know what? They use different titles in Japan too. Like middleweight was light heavyweight here, something like that, right?
Middleweight was essentially light heavyweight.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
yeah. So it was different, but yeah, Krokop always was a heavyweight. Wanderlei, anything from what they considered a middleweight up into heavyweight and open weight.
But they had the open weight Grand Prix was something that to me just said this is really what martial arts competition's about. The weight classes didn't matter, and you had a lot of probably a lot of brain damage going on back then. But Krokop won that tournament, and I feel like that's probably where he left the best of himself, because obviously when Pride folded, then he went to the UFC, and then the Gonzaga stuff and all the losses. It's funny because the score, James Lynch, I might have wrote it. James Lynch or one of those guys, or Nick Baldwin, I forget who writes over there now. Just wrote about like the busts, UFC signing busts, and they had a picture of Crow Cop there, and I was just like, you know what? It's hard to argue because, you know, towards the end of his career, maybe he started getting some wins back, but then obviously he had the medical issues where that made him retire. I saw some training footage. He still works out and hits the bag and stuff, like even though he's not fighting anymore. But it's just definitely like one of those things that you're like, damn man, I really wish folks could have seen him in Pride, you know. But you'd be, if you talk to today's MMA fan about Pride or any of that the stuff we're talking about, they're gonna look at you like you have two heads.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to argue the bus thing in a sense, I guess. Um, if you were around that time, and obviously, who'd you say wrote it? James Lynch? Is that who?
I didn't look at the author. It's either
Okay,
him or the other dude.
so it's somebody who's
Yeah,
respected and knows what
yeah,
they're talking about. But
yeah, yeah.
the UFC really dropped the ball a lot of that too. Fans may not remember when they had Crow Cop come in, they had him fight Eddie Sanchez in his debut. Eddie Sanchez was a tough dude, local fighter from my neighborhood, um, and a tough dude, but not on Mirko's level. Was a wasted fight. Then they gave him the Gonzaga, or then they did Gonzaga and Congo. It The UFC tried to play the game of we need to build this guy up at a time when you had all the highlights you really needed. They owned Pride. They had his library. Um, the Ultimate Fighter was kicking ass on Spike. They could have at any point showed his fights. I think. I guess he came over maybe slightly before the Full Pride, but I think by the time he fought, I think UFC 67 is when he fought Eddie Sanchez, if I remember right,
Mm-hmm.
and then he fought Crow Cop at or not Crow Cop. He fought at UFC 70. He fought Gonzaga.
It's yeah. I'm reading Fernando's comment. Yeah, man. I mean, I was I'm always a fan of the underdog, man. I always like to root for the thing that folks don't know about. I mean, you can see that with my coverage now. Like I like to cover regional stuff. I like covering Bellator more than I like covering the UFC for that reason. And so back then, to see the Crow Cop take that L, I was just like, dude, you're not making us look good right now. So
No, and it hurt for fans of Pride. I just think that the UFC really dropped the ball. To get back to my point, trying to set the fight up with Couture. Um, Couture might have ate his lunch with his wrestling ability at the time. That might have exposed a little bit, but really not just bringing in Crow Cop and just having him fight. I mean, no disrespect to the late Justin Eilers, but you just mentioned an event not all that, a year and a half prior basically to this, where we had Justin Eilers. I think he was coming. Yeah, I think he had come off a win, if I
mm-hmm.
remember right. But he's fighting for the heavyweight title. Buenatello again, good guy, good fighter, but fighting for the title. You get Crow Cop in there. The whole world wanted to see Crow Cop versus Couture. The UFC screws around. MMA does its thing, which it always does. Everybody loses. Sure enough, that's what happens, and then we never got to see that fight, and we ended up getting a lot of Crow Cop against guys that we didn't necessarily. Anthony Parash and he eventually his last fight he avenged the loss to Gonzaga in a great fight. If that would be a fight that fans should look up. Crow Cop versus Gonzaga 2.
Yeah, he avenged that
awesome.
loss. That's what I was saying. Like towards the end, he was starting to get some wins back there. And
Yeah, I
then
mean
obviously,
he went to Japan and Ryzen, and he went on a big winning streak. I mean, I think he ended his career like on a 9 or 10 fight winning streak. So,
mm-hmm.
yeah, that was Crow Cop. But the event if you want to get back to the event, I mean, you talk about a star-studded show. We don't get it. Doesn't exist like that anymore,
No.
and it never honestly will. Not to steal your thunder, but I'm just looking at the names, and on a single event when you have Crow Cop, Josh Barnett, Arona, Overeem, Shogun Hua,
Yeah, man.
um, Alexander Emelianenko, Sergey Karatanov,
Speaking of which, really quick,
Nogueira, Vanderlei.
Sergey Karatanov fights for Bellator now, and they're going to re-air Bellator 225. That's an event that I covered for MMA News, and the main event was Matt Mitrione, Sergey Karatanov. That's going to be, they're going to show the entire event on YouTube. So if folks need some fresh, if you didn't see it, you can watch the whole thing on YouTube. It'll be Saturday, I believe they're going to show it. So make sure if you're not on Bellator's YouTube channel, you subscribe and hit the little bell nonsense so you can get the notification if you ain't got jack going on, which none of us should, because we're supposed to be staying away from everybody and everything.
So obviously you can get the Pride Final Conflict Absolute, the whole Final Conflict open weight tournament. You can get that on Fight Pass. The World Valley Tudo Championship events I mentioned earlier are available on YouTube. If you search it, there's a couple really good no holds barred sites or pages, I guess you would say, where the guys post those full events. The IVC events there are another one. IFC, I'm sorry. IVC is great too. Probably hard to find in English commentary. World Valley Tudo Championship is English commentary, and the IFC, if you really want to get into early Igor Vovchanchyn stuff, that would be something to get into, the IFC Kiev event. But one other old school event that is harder to find. You might be able to find the individual events. I actually came across the VHS and I have it, a bootleg copy, I think directly from Brazil. I got it from one of my training partners, probably in like 98 maybe. And it's called the Brazil Open Fight 1997. Kind of an oddball event. You probably won most people probably have never even heard of it. The thing is that this event is the debut of Dan Henderson. So Dan Henderson goes down to Brazil, never having had a public. I'm sure behind the scenes they did plenty of fighting, where he was training out there, with Quest, and I think it was even in Arizona, which all of a sudden their fight team skips my mind. But so Henderson goes there, 4-man tournament, other side of the bracket, Jose Pele Landy Johns, an old school no holds barred legend of fighting. Unfortunately, there's a huge upset in one of those fights. We don't get to see Henderson versus Pele in the finals, but it's the debut of Dan Henderson. If you can find it, great. Also a heavyweight tournament. This one we do get the final. We get Kevin Randleman on one side against Tom Erickson, on the other side. Tom Erickson was like the 6'8", 300-pound wrestling beast that at the time people did not want to mess with. He had won an 8-man tournament, martial arts reality super fighting event earlier in the year, or within the last year prior to this event. So he had some name recognition coming in. But Tom Erickson, Kevin Randleman, they meet in the finals. Randleman becomes victim of one of the most brutal KOs that you will ever see. And one of the early cases where you feared for a fighter's safety, as he's got an oxygen mask on with blood going everywhere, and them carrying him out of the cage.
I don't know why you're talking about that. Just made me think, talking about old school MMA. One of the worst cuts for me still is Marvin Eastman's face cut from I think it's
UFC 43. Yeah, 43. I was at that fight.
What was that? Vitor Belfort, right?
Vitor Belfort, yeah, knee to the face,
knee to the head, yeah. I mean, it's literally like here to here.
Yeah, that's another event. Chuck Tito won. Tank Abbott chemo. Frank Mir's on the card. Vernon White's on the card. That's another UFC 43. But again, for the Valley Tudo, if you just want to see some violence, no rules, stuff that kind of really kick-started this. Again, stuff you mentioned we couldn't really see anymore today, but we wouldn't see it today.
No.
You had mismatches back then a lot of times. So you get guys like Dan Henderson, who obviously is world-class, Randleman, Erickson, as I mentioned earlier, Kerr. In some of the fights they run into studs and really tough dudes, but the skill discrepancy is so much different that you just see. I mean, there's just some sheer violence and beatdowns. But
Yeah.
again, Brazil Open fights, World Valley Tudo Championships, and the IVC and IFC would be ones that I would definitely get into. Um, one of these days, we'll have to figure out a way to do a quote unquote fight companion thing and maybe watch some of these.
Yeah,
But
well, I mean, we can watch them if they're airing. We don't have to put them on this broadcast. But if like folks are watching it, I know that's how Rogan does his thing. We can do something like that. Like I wanted to do it this past Saturday, but like you said, I mean, they showed like the edited, dramatic, narrated versions of really great fights that they would have been better if they just showed the straight fight from
I had
beginning to
people
end.
text messaging me complaining about it. It's like, why
Yeah,
UFC? You can't do it right. You have the world in your hands right now. You're the only sport. People are tuning in to watch old fights of yours. Nobody does that for really any other sports. People don't tune in to watch a football game from 4 years ago. I mean,
yeah,
but they're tuning in to watch these fights, and they put on this like documentary style. It's
yeah.
like a giant hype video. It's like the pre-fight video clips going, and then no, just show us the damn fights.
Yeah,
Especially,
literally the drama is already in. I mean, that's the thing about combat sports that makes it unique. I mean, the drama builds as you're watching the fight from the first bell to the last minutes of the last round. You know what I mean? Like I mean, perfect example is Weili Zhang versus Joanna, former champion. She you know, if you did that to that fight, you'd be doing it a disservice by not showing every round. You know
it's
what I
funny
mean?
you mentioned that because I saw that fight was airing. They're going to show that on ESPN or ESPN2. It
Mm,
was airing late night though. I was going through the. I can't. It may have already aired. I don't know, but I was going through my guide trying to find something that we could comment on, and I saw that it was just labeled that though. It was Weili Zhang versus Joanna. So they were just showing that single fight. It was like a
mm.
30-minute or an hour
So
long clip.
talking about pay-per-views, well, I mean, I know we were talking about it at the beginning, but before we close out of this week's episode, what do you think is gonna what do you think they're gonna do with 249? Like, is it gonna be on a boat or in some type of castle? Is it gonna be like Karate Combat? Like, what do we what do you think
Um,
what do you what I have no idea. Dana
I
White's not
I
really
think
talking
I
about
think
it,
they're going to
so
go to Russia.
mm,
I think they'll find a place in Russia, do it with no crowd, but still be allowed to have the thing about doing the United States is that no one's really allowing you to have groups of like 10 or more. So
yeah.
even if you go bare minimum between cameramen, cornermen, referee, fighters, doctors and judge, I mean,
And
judges alone, you're over that count.
do you think they're going to make us buy that pay per view too? I mean, they have to.
Oh yeah.
They're
Oh
not
yeah,
going
let's be serious here. They're throwing away the live gate, which
Yeah,
would have been like $9 million probably for this fight.
yeah,
I mean, prior to all this breaking out, I was glancing at stuff just to see about possibly coming out there, and the cheapest ticket I could find was via resale, and it was like $300.
mm,
So there was no. The UFC was going to make a bundle just on the
yeah.
gate for the live show. So there's no doubt about it that they're gonna go after some of that that
Pay per
money,
view
you
revenue.
know,
Yeah,
especially if White's buddy Trump sends out everybody a check, he's gonna
yeah,
want to dig into a little bit of that
yeah,
cash.
yeah, yeah,
But yeah, I mean, but that's the fight that we've wanted to see for so long. I don't like how it's going down. I wish you could just say, hey, just postpone it. At this point, I'm not really like going crazy about it. Um, yeah, see, Fernando mentions they're doing the original plans for a pit surrounding it. We talked about that last week.
hmm
If we're gonna do this, let's do it right. Let's have pits. Let's do it in the middle of a. I don't even we said in a cave or in a. If we're gonna do it, that let's get crazy. Set up a stage, have a one-off freak show, blood sport looking event.
yeah,
You know what I mean? Like that won't happen. I think the UFC has too much pride, I guess, in their quote unquote brand
yeah.
to go off color too much. But I mean, we'd love to see that. We'll see how this goes. it's a fight we need to see. We can't postpone it if they can run it somewhere, just because of the history of it. We know, you know as well as I do, if they postpone it, we're going to get into Ramadan. Someone's going to bust up a knee. Someone's going to have a
Kidney
toothache.
stones, or
Exactly. So if you get to a point where both guys can do it, now the crazy shit will be when they fly to wherever they decide to do this, and somebody misses weight, and they have to cancel. Then all of a sudden, that's when
yeah,
the world of MMA kicks in, and we realize that they're putting on an empty show with the co-main event of,
yeah,
Roy Nelson versus
yeah,
Joe Charles or something. You know what
yeah,
I mean? So I don't know, but we'll see what happens. Hopefully, all this. Hopefully, the world stays isolated, like the two of us are being responsible,
yeah, yeah,
we get our fights back, we get our sports back, and
yeah.
uh, I mean, I
In
can
the,
only watch stupid what I watch, stupid robot fights and cherry picking championships or spitting
yeah.
championships and Amtrak
Well,
truck racing, and I just nonsense over the weekend.
yeah. I mean, there is hopefully they don't make them not do it, but Submission Underground will be on Fight Pass this Sunday, and I mean, hopefully Chael can break up the all the binge watching and Tiger Kings and all that shit that everybody's watching now. Because you can only watch so many gay polygamist tiger murderers documentaries.
I haven't watched that. I don't know if I'll get into that one.
Oh, you need to get into that one.
Jeez.
Yeah.
We'll see, but
Yeah,
I don't
no,
know.
that's a dark tunnel. Trust me, once you're in though, like it's a 7 hour, you're gonna be like, oh, I got to see how this ends. Trust me, it's worth it if you got the time, and I know we all got the
We
time.
all got the time.
So
Yeah, I don't know. We'll see what happens, but the Submission Underground thing will be interesting. Whether they can do it, because it's in Portland, right?
yeah, and didn't they just get up their numbers too? And
Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
Portland's not exactly a great place to be currently.
yeah.
If you're trying to avoid this, again, if they have a rule of 10 people in a room, I suppose maybe he can isolate it to get to that bare number, between, like I said, a couple cameramen, a
If
referee.
anybody could figure it out, Chael will figure it out.
Yeah, or he'll just cheat. We
That's what I meant. Yeah.
we know that about Chael. So
Yeah.
odds, hope if it happens, great. It might get me to resubscribe to Fight Pass. Fight Pass has been kind of my ESPN Plus to use. So
The real fight sport thing. Yeah.
we'll see, but until then, we'll see where we're at. But fans can always follow us at Combat Hour on Twitter, Coast-to-Coast Combat Hour on Instagram. You can follow me at MMA Hawk 21 on Twitter and Instagram. Follow Ed at Carbazol on Twitter and Carbeerzol on Instagram. Follow him on everything you got, dude. My MMA News, MMAnews.com, SureDog.
1:37 p.m.
1:37. Yeah, we look forward to your wrestling writing. Hey man, good hustle and doing a good job, man. You're one of the harder workers out there, so you should be
Trying.
proud of that. And you got some time now, so expect to see some good fucking content coming out.
Yeah. We just need the fights to happen.
All right, man. Take it easy. Talk to you next week.